What makes a good general great? What elevates them to be legends, studied for generations after the fact? Is it just success? Napoleon ultimately lost the First French Empire after Waterloo. Only a few generals like Caesar ever went completely undefeated. Is it revolutionizing a new system to wage war? Belisarius never transformed the Byzantine army, but he was very good at using what he had. Maybe it's securing an empire that lasts generations. Alexander and Tamerlane's empires collapsed very shortly after their deaths. What unites these great generals? Is there simply some sort of je ne sais quoi about the whole thing? Should we just apply the Potter-Stewart standard and trust that we'll know it when we see it? The 30 Years' War was the single bloodiest European conflict up until the First World War, with an estimated 8 million casualties. Originally, it started as a religious war between Catholics and Protestants between realms of the Holy Roman Empire. The Kaiser, Ferdinand II, was much less tolerant of Protestantism than his predecessor Rudolf II, and had been implementing a great deal of anti-Protestant legislation during his tenure. Ferdinand was nervous that the Protestants were starting to gain a majority in the electoral college of the empire. This, in turn, could lead to a Protestant voting bloc and a Protestant Kaiser. In turn, Ferdinand's pro-Catholic policies had threatened to undermine the delicate peace between the southern Catholic states and the northern Protestant ones that had been set at the Peace of Augsburg. These tensions led to violations of that treaty by all sides and all sects, Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists. The states of the empire split into two forces: the Catholic League, which was headed by Duke Maximilian and aided by the mighty House of Habsburg, with holdings in the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, and Austria, and the Protestant Union, headed by Frederick V of the Palatine. Like most conflicts throughout history, while religion did play a significant role in the 30 Years' War, more secular concerns of politics were also important. The powerful Habsburgs were one of the most prominent families of Europe, and plenty of regional powers felt threatened by Habsburg military power and political influence, with powers from Scotland to the Ottoman Empire all being embroiled within the 30 Years' War at one point or another. Europe had, with the rise of nations and alliances, become a much closer place, and the loose confederations of feudal levies during the Crusades had transformed into a much larger, much more sustained coalition force in this new, early modern era. This was part of the reason that the 30 Years' War was so bloody. Nations were able to fund larger, well-equipped armies, and of course this also came in conjunction with outbreaks of typhus and plague, famines and blights. Those who did not die were often displaced, and this caused severe demographic shock to Central Europe. Now these coalitions were not entered into all at once. There was much in the way of horse trading and open bidding for support. The early Bohemian Rebellion, which kicked off the war, for example, had promised the title of King of Bohemia to Frederick V, as well as the Elector of Saxony, the Duke of Savoy, and the Prince of Transylvania, all at once. When the Kaiser crushed the rebellion, his heavy-handed policies enraged Protestants in the north, many of whom jumped to support the anti-Habsburg coalition. One of these was Christian IV, King of Denmark-Norway, and the Duke of Holstein. The empire, to fight this new Lutheran king, employed one of the best generals of that era, Albrecht von Wallenstein, who conducted an excellent campaign that broke Christian's armies and forced him to withdraw his support in order to retain his kingdom. Soon after von Wallenstein's victory, though, he was sidelined by Ferdinand, who grew suspicious of Albrecht's ambitions. At the same time, another Protestant monarch was growing wary of Catholic land acquisition in his backyard, and with the defeat of Christian IV, he decided that it was time for him to take the field. This king would be the Swedish monarch Gustav II Adolf, or as he is better known, Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North. This is the First Battle of Breitenfeld. The early modern period and the rise of the professional army gave way to serious transformations across military science. The infantry revolution had made cavalry less important compared to large numbers of infantry using polearms in tight formation, and the advances in metallurgy and chemistry gave rise to the quintessential field artillery piece, the cannon. These changes required new ideas in doctrine, formation, and tactics. Each component was useful, but was also vulnerable when used improperly. Commanders needed to have a real sense as to how all these different components could work together to maximize results on the battlefield, minimize casualties, and bring victory to their side. This idea, called combined arms tactics, turns good armies into war-winning machines. This is best evidenced in the defining early modern tactical doctrine, pike and shot. Much as the name suggests, pike and shot tactics are defined as using infantry with long pikes supported by musketmen. The penetrative power of the musket ball was significant, and the large masses of pikes prevented the ranged units from being overrun by cavalry while they reloaded. This was originally developed by the Spanish general Cordoba, who designed the famous Spanish tercio. These ideas were improved upon by the Dutch, who standardized drill and pike length to improve training, as well as shrinking the large Spanish units to increase flexibility and put more men on the front lines in order to increase their firepower. Gustavus took these ideas and improved upon them even further. He shrank the depth of his units to about 4 to 6 ranks deep, and changed the shape from squares to rectangles, so therefore more men were on the front. To further increase his riflemen's output, the king had his army drilled in salvo fire tactics. Salvo fire is deceptively simple. It simply means firing all at once, rather than firing upon loading and aiming the weapon. This salvo fire would maximize manpower losses on the opposing side and stymie the advance of approaching units. No one wants to walk into a line of musketmen about to fire. Gustavus would have 2 or 3 ranks fire at once, then this would be followed by another salvo, and then a charge with pike and swords upon the survivors. The recipient of this would break under the stress, which would culminate in a bloody pursuit. On the wings, Gustavus used his cavalry as a mobile arm, highly powerful and used to attack artillery positions and drive their crews from the field in order to silence the guns. As was typical practice before a battle of this time period, cavalry frequently engaged each other, with the weaker forces chased off so that the other cavalry could use their speed to strike the flanks of the main line. Gustavus wanted to maximize the chance that his horsemen would win this critical engagement. As such, his cavalry units came equipped with mobile infantry, who shot towards the enemy in volley before the battle, which disrupted the enemy unit cohesion. Once his cavalry cleared the field, they'd silence the artillery, then circle in to hit the enemy infantry on the flanks or from behind. Perhaps the most radical innovation on the field was his new artillery techniques. The Swedish king took his idea of smaller and more mobile units to the artillery as well. He broke the typically large artillery companies into smaller batteries and moving them with his units. Gustavus used the newly designed light cannon as a support piece, assigning these mobile guns to individual units to provide them with artillery support in the event of isolation or just getting out of range of the guns. These light cannons could also provide support fire at gaps when a sudden burst of firepower was needed. His light 3-pounder cannon could be moved by 1 horse or 3 men. The 4-pounder was still only about a quarter ton, and this could be moved by 2 horses. The 9-pounder demi-culverin was still mobile enough to be a viable tactical unit, though it required a team. Gustavus also revolutionized loading techniques by developing pre-made artillery cartridges as opposed to the common practice of ladling powder, placing wadding, and finally loading the ball. This development increased the rate of fire for his cannons, which gave his heavy cannons more firepower, and dramatically increased the response time of his light cannons in response to anything that developed on the field, and this better fit the Gustavian model of flexibility on the field. Unlike the earlier leather cannons, the light cannons' copper and bronze barrels wouldn't overheat and deform after the first shot, which increased their field longevity. The heavy field cannon would remain a static piece meant to bring great destructive power on a single area, but these light cannons would move with their units and be quick to load and fire, and this meant they were perfect for the Gustavian model of flexible, aggressive tactics. Almost as important as understanding how to use these different units was Gustavus's ideology. His conception of smaller units to more rapidly respond to changing battlefield conditions was hardly new. The Roman cohort was much smaller than the more modern Spanish tercio, but the improving technology had made deep units pushing pikes against each other obsolete. This was picked up first by Maurice of Nassau and now by King Gustavus. These shallow units could quickly rearrange themselves on the field rather than these clunky 50-rank units of ages past, and this gave the Swedes a commanding advantage during the middle of a battle, where circumstances changed based on the normal chaos of combat and morale fluctuations between units. To complement this flexibility, Gustavus encouraged unit initiative, particularly for his cavalry, and encouraged aggressive tactics to shock his enemy and cause a panic. Far from merely being an aggressive bulldog, though, the king also introduced a fixed light caliber of rifles for his troops. This simplified supply problems that had dogged armies with less regimented equipment. His troops were also regularly drilled and, very importantly, regularly paid. Gustavus was quite keen to break barriers of class within the army itself. Men in the cavalry and artillery corps would train in infantry units with infantry tactics, and mounted infantry served with the cavalry. Previously, cavalry had been seen as the province of the elite, hearkening back to the medieval feudal aristocracy of the mounted knight, and artillery crews were considered a higher class than the infantry, but Gustavus was adamant in demonstrating that all parts of his army were valued. Taken together, these Gustavian tactics and Gustavian outlook were new, modern, and incredibly effective. When Gustavus entered the war, the Protestants were not very fond of his intervention, perhaps fearing that Gustavus wished to annex their provinces as Swedish territories, or perhaps they were simply resentful of foreign interference or the war continuing. After all, the Catholics were firmly in their ascendancy at this point in the war, and some Protestant princes were hoping for an end to save their lands as well as their heads. The empire was slow to respond to Gustavus's landing. Gustavus, in his earlier campaigns, had been rather ineffective. Sweden was a large power, to be sure, but not considered a great power. The empire was currently engaged anyway in northern Italy for the Mantuan campaign. As such, Gustavus was able to establish a beachhead while he concluded a war with Poland that he inherited from his father. Eventually, the Imperials responded, with their new senior commander, Johann Zerkles, Graf Tilly. Johann is the second of the two imperial commanders, along with von Wallenstein, for the first half of the 30 Years' War. He was a very seasoned commander who prided himself in his finely disciplined infantry. He had commanded troops in the Bohemian Revolt and fought admirably in the campaigns against Christian IV along with von Wallenstein. As Gustavus was treating with the northern German state leaders in an attempt to gain local support, Zerkles attacked the city of Magdeburg, which had promised support to Gustavus. Once the soldiers broke through the defenses, a general massacre occurred, with about 5 of 6 people dying in a city of 30,000. The city never recovered. Magdeburg was one of the most vital and vibrant cities in what's now Germany at this time. The destruction of the city was truly shocking. Protestants in the war claimed that Tilly had ordered the massacre. Contemporary historians doubt that he did. It's worth noting what the standards of war were like at the time to better explain this. When a commander besieged a town, offering a surrender at discretion was considered normal. A defender could surrender the city, usually in exchange for protection from a sack. Hence the name surrender at discretion, as opposed to an unconditional surrender. If a defender refused, and the attacker was forced to breach the defenses, no quarter was expected. Saxon warfare were bloody affairs, but this was hardly unusual, and Tilly did offer multiple chances for the mayor of Magdeburg to surrender, all of which were refused because he believed that Swedish reinforcements were incoming. Following this, the Protestant Union spread the word about the slaughter, much as they had done during the brutal crackdown on the Bohemian Revolt, and Gustavus and Tilly prepared for battle. Tilly had marched his forces to the electorate of Saxony. This was the shortest distance between the Swedish army and the imperial one. Saxony so far had been spared by the war, and its elector, John George I, was a staunch Lutheran, But George had far more secular concerns to worry about. John George was deeply ambivalent about the growing power of both the Palatine and Brandenburg, and feared that should one of them become the first Protestant Kaisar, Saxony would be weakened significantly for the Kaisar's benefit. The Catholic Habsburgs would be far more willing to weaken their enemies by enriching Saxony, and using John George to stress their commitment to the Peace of Augsburg and split the Protestant cause. When Ferdinand became more stridently anti-Protestant, John George had made many formal protests and attempted to push for diplomatic censure and curbing of the emperor's policies, but he did not participate in any rebellion, nor did he break his alliance with Ferdinand. With Tilly on one side of him and Gustavus on the other, both sides attempted to court Saxony and John George. Tilly asked for passage through Saxony so that he could face Gustavus, and Gustavus looked for a Protestant-to-Protestant alliance to add the sizable Saxon levies to his own forces, and John George was stuck in the middle. Finally, when it appeared that George was not going to let Tilly through, he marched forward anyway, and his army began pillaging the countryside, as was normal for armies of the time period. Tilly had hoped that the aggressive action would make George stay out of the way, fearing that his lands would be attacked and the loss of an easy neutrality. This backfired, and pushed George into an alliance with Gustavus, who added the Saxon troops to the Swedish forces, giving Gustavus about a 7,000-man advantage over the imperial army. Unfortunately, while both the Empire and the Swedes had a solid core force of disciplined regulars, the Saxon forces were green, barely trained, and not at all experienced with the shock and fire of war. The battleground picked was flat terrain, with marshes and streams on the side, and little in the way of terrain characteristics to hamper the march of either force, along the road between Podolwitz and Leipzig. The two armies met each other while marching along the road and elected to do battle, making this an encounter battle or a meeting engagement. Now, a meeting engagement is defined by neither army expecting to do battle, but both electing to do so when it becomes clear that the enemy is on the field. This is in contrast to a pitched battle, where both armies expect the battle beforehand, an ambush, where one side expects to do battle where the other does not, or a siege, where one side does not have the option to withdraw. In an encounter battle, fixed defenses and fieldworks are typically not part of the battle plan, as there is not enough time to craft them, and it is very difficult to protect the vulnerable engineering corps while they build and remove waste material. Both forces elected to establish their forces over a wide area, with Gustavus setting his line in front of Podolwitz with himself on the right. The Saxon forces took the left along the Loberbach. Outnumbered, Tilly elected to spread his line as wide as possible to maximize frontage, which left his reserve very low. In the morning, Tilly's Croatian skirmishers clashed with the Swedish musketeers using their modern matchlock muskets, while the Saxons and Swedes continued crossing the Loberbach and fixing their position. John George, not a very conscientious student of military science, used a formation that was practiced by the Dutch, arraying his forces into a wedge of infantry with his cavalry supporting the wings. This formation, notably, was not one that his forces had trained in. The Swedes were using their wide rectangular formations and kept their light guns ready to move. Tilly was using the more traditional tercio square, and his artillery, which were the heavy field cannons, were brought up slowly to the line and aimed across the field, ready to fire at Tilly's order. The Graf was perhaps apprehensive that either of his flanks could be attacked, on the right by the Saxons and on the left by the Swedes, but his resolve to do battle was firm. At high noon the battle began. Both sides opened fire with their heavy cannons, and this artillery barrage lasted for about 2 hours. Gustavus's artillery cartridges showed their worth. Contemporary records show that his cannons fired about 4 shots for every one of the imperial cannons, and that extra firepower was devastating. Plenty of Tilly's regiments were pounded below fighting strength before ever engaging in hand-to-hand combat. About 2,000 of the Empire's forces were dead on the ground, about half of that of the Swedish Saxon forces. by the time the barrage stopped at around 2 or 2:30. Now this is important. Time is very difficult in this battle because while pocket watches did exist at the time, they weren't very accurate. Nevertheless, at around 2 or 2:30, the Imperial wings began to charge. The energetic General Pappenheim led the charge with his black cuirassiers on the left, and General Furstenberg attacked on the right. The Imperial forces looked to hit the Swedish line at both ends. Pappenheim would attempt 7 charges on the Swedish right, using a technique called the Caracal. In the military, a Caracal is where a horseman rides with 2 pistols. He turns the horse slightly to fire with 1 pistol, then slightly in the other direction to fire with the other, then he retires to the side in the rear, clearing the way for the rank behind him and moving to a safe distance while he could reload his pistols and get back into formation. What's important is this entire formation stays in motion. This is the defining characteristic of the Caracal. You either move slightly forward to press the attack, or you move slightly backward when you are receiving an advancing infantry unit. This keeps up a steady output of shot while keeping the advance out of range with their pikes. Now this technique is a little outdated at the time period. Plenty of cavalry units had abandoned this in favor of firing both pistols and then charging with the cavalry saber. Historians have wondered what Pappenheim's aim was and how much of this was ordered by Graf Tilly, and how much of this was Pappenheim charging against orders. One argument puts forth that Tilly had attempted a double envelopment, looking to avoid sending his infantry against the center where the heavy Swedish guns could fire heavy canister shot and make mincemeat of his infantry. His idea was to pin the Swedish cavalry with Pappenheim's black cuirassiers, as the Swedish cavalry outnumbered the Imperial horse, while Furstenberg swept the Saxons from the field and came in on the Swedish left, rendering the entire thing a classic pincer attack. Another argument suggests that Pappenheim charged against orders, and Furstenberg, thinking that he must have missed a signal thanks to the wind blowing the artillery smoke in his direction, charged against the Saxons. Another idea combines the two, that Tilly had intended for an attack against the Saxons, but Pappenheim, eager for glory, charged against orders and advanced too far into the Swedish reserves. Whichever the reason, Pappenheim ran into Gustavus's innovative musket and cavalry technique, who used their muskets to break up Pappenheim's momentum before countercharging. Furstenberg had better luck on the right against the Saxons. His high-energy charge and effective firing techniques, combined with the Saxons' unfamiliarity with this Dutch formation, quickly cleared the Saxon cavalry, and then, faced with a highly mobile unit that threatened to hit their unsupported left flank, the Saxons routed about 30 minutes after the charge began. Furstenberg's force of 2,500 panicked and routed the 18,000-man Saxon forces. Immediately, Tilly ordered an oblique march, moving his infantry heavily on the right to send additional support. In military science, this is called oblique order, where one side of the line is heavily reinforced, used to overwhelm and envelop one side of the line, and then roll up the rest of the battle line, using each unit's collapse to get further around the edge of the line and continue up the flank. At this point, around 3:30, Tilly has the battle well in hand. He's driven about 40% of the enemy from the field and has given himself the manpower advantage. Yet the smoke continues to blow in the direction of his troops. 4 of Tilly's tercios get lost in the confusion and end up marching in the wrong way, away from the battle. Field Marshal Gustav Horn, one of Gustavus's senior and most respected subordinates, reads the field and realizes his left flank is about to become vulnerable thanks to the collapse of the Saxon line. Furiously signaling, Horn orders his units to reform and refuse the flank, turning his line from a straight one into an L shape, which protects the flank. The smaller size of Adolphus's new military made them respond far quicker than the tercios would have under Tilly. Within 15 minutes, Horn's lines were formed up to face Tilly and Furstenberg, and they opened fire with their salvos and light field guns. The Swedish king then gave his order to charge with his own cavalry, and they attacked the Imperial heavy cannons, seizing them and beginning to open up a barrage upon the Imperial troops. As soon as the cannons stopped, Horns's troops charged with pike and sword after their volley, and the shock and speed of the attack took the Imperial troops by surprise, and the line was put to rout. Lieutenant Colonel Muschamp, who commanded the Spens Regiment, remarked in his journal the effect of the combined infantry and artillery barrage, and he is one of our best primary sources we have that details King Gustavus's military reforms at the ground level. First, giving fire unto 3 little field pieces that I had before me, I suffered my musketeers to give their volleys till I came within pistol shot of the enemy, at which time I gave order to the first 3 ranks to discharge at once, and after them the other 3, which done we fell pell-mell into their ranks, knocking them down with the stock of the musket and our swords. Breitenfeld shattered the Imperial armies, which now barely numbered 7,000 healthy men. Graf Tilly was seriously wounded in the pursuit and forced Ferdinand II to reinstate Wallenstein. The Catholic League, whose victory beforehand seemed almost like a sure thing, suddenly faced a resurgent Protestant Union, which along with loans from Catholic, though anti-Habsburg France, made diplomatic outreach look more tempting to the southern Catholic imperials. Eventually, the 30 Years' War would last another 7 years, to be concluded at the bargaining table with the Peace of Westphalia, leaving a devastated Central Europe in its wake. But perhaps the longest-term effects were Gustavus's reforms. His new, combined arms tactics confirmed the era of the Stormaxtiden, the Swedish word for the time of great power, synonymous with their days of empire, and ensured it would last for another 90 years until the Great Northern War. The Swedish combined arms reforms outlasted the Swedish Empire by quite a bit, as they would inspire Napoleon, and later, during World War I, would inspire great commanders like Arthur Currie and John Monash to look for ways to combine the new technologies, which was then airplanes, tanks, artillery, and infantry, into a single coherent whole, to achieve their objectives on the field. So now we come back to the original question and ponder. Was there something that united these great generals in their greatness? If we add Gustavus to our list, is there something that unites them? Alexander at Gaugamela, Hannibal at Cannae, Napoleon at Austerlitz, Gustavus at Breitenfeld. Is there a common thread that ties those 4 and countless other great generals together? Perhaps there isn't one answer, but these great generals all have an understanding of warfare that is as scientific as it is instinctive, combining all of the input and making sense of the chaos quickly to seize victory where it can be achieved. This ability to synthesize everything at lightning speed is the mark of one of the truly great of all time. Thanks for listening.